everyone, you're welcome to today's edition of Editorials, a broadcast from Canada. My name is Sandra Asante. Today we'll be looking at the never-ending conflict in Tigray, as well as the university students safely evacuating Tigray region. So don't go anywhere, I'll be back with more. You're welcome back from the break. Thank you so much for staying with me. We'll start off with the safely evacuating of the university students, and more than 1,000 students arrived in Addis Ababa this weekend after being evacuated from the fast-moving conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region. A convoy of 18 buses transported the students from the embattled region where the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF) recently gained control from government forces. At the end of the two-day trip, eager relatives were waiting for them at the capital's Lambaret bus terminal. A candlelight vigil was also held there for Baraket Desi, a second-year student from the Mekelle University who was killed by government soldiers. The Tigray region is home to 4 of the Ethiopia's 45 universities and has 82,000 students from all regional states enrolled. Worried parents had demanded the federal government ensure the safe return of their children, despite a communication blackout imposed on Tigray by the military since they declared a unilateral ceasefire in June. The International Organization for Immigration, IOM, and it had been helping students to communicate with their families. Over 10,000 students have been able to leave via the Afar and Amhara regions. The 9-month war in Africa's second most populous country with 110 million people. Now we move to the never-ending. On June 28th, the Ethiopian government declared a unilateral ceasefire in the war in Tigray. There was optimism that the ceasefire would help draw down the conflict which erupted in November 2020. The fighting followed a dispute over the constitutional mandate of the current Ethiopian administration after it delayed elections amid of the COVID-19 pandemic and a border falling out between the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF), formerly the dominant political party in the country's political system, and Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Throughout this article, the term Tigrayan forces is used to refer to the Tigrayan and belligerents in the conflict. They were also referred to as the Tigray People's Liberation Front in the direct quote. The conflict quickly drew into other armed groups, including Eritrea and Amhara forces, as well as ethnic militias. While the full extent of the fatalities is uncertain, it is clear that the conflict involves not only armed and belligerents but also civilians who have found themselves in the crosshairs. Thousands of people have been killed and roughly 2 million have been displaced since the outbreak of the violence. Furthermore, there have been reports of ethnically targeted violence and sexual violence used as a weapon of war. There have been calls for independent investigations into the reported human rights abuses, as well as suggestions for a national dialogue to address political drivers of the violence, objectives that would be easier to achieve in the context of legitimate commitment to a ceasefire. At the very last, there was hope that the ceasefire would be accompanied by the greater humanitarian access in Tigray, where an estimated 5 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. Yet, in the week since the ceasefire was declared, it has become clear that the ceasefire did not lay a foundation for conflict resolution. Fighting has continued in the region and armed forces from the country's other ethno-regional states have been mobilized to contribute to the fight alongside the regime. In recent days, the Ethiopian Prime Minister urged all Ethiopian civilians to join the fight, encouraging those who were eligible to join the defense forces, special forces, and militias to show their patriotism, and asserting that every Ethiopian must work closely with the security forces in being the eye and ears of the country in order to track down the exposed spices and the TPLF. The federal government's reliance on militias in the fight could produce even more volatility. Some observers have raised concerns about the federal government rhetoric in the weeks following a ceasefire, suggesting that it may encourage ethnically targeted violence, extreme violence as such. In addition to the recent exhortations for Ethiopians to join the fight, the Prime Minister has used words such as weeds, canker, and disease to describe the TPLF. He's claiming that, but we all know that it's a fallacy. So the ceasefire declaration may be regarded as a hindsight, as a turning point for the war in Tigray, but as a harbinger of escalation rather than peace building. Despite the surge in optimism earlier this summer, the conflict now seems as intractable as ever, and the prospect of a negotiated settlement appears faint. Now, with Tigray's conflict, what comes next? That's what we're looking at right now. The complex emergency in Tigray is poised to escalate, and there appears to be little will to broker that sort of political settlement necessary to draw down the violence. The array of actors involved in the violence complicates the prospect of a negotiated settlement and introduces a number of distinct political agendas and political spoilers as well. This complexity is only growing with news in recent days that Tigrayan forces are discussing forming an alliance with the Oromo Liberation Army, an insurgent group in Ethiopia's Ethiopia's Oromia region. Meanwhile, the suffering of civilians in the war-affected areas is being compounded by the lack of humanitarian access. Territorial disputes between Tigray and Amhara may continue to fuel violence in the region. The regions in question, which include fertile farmland, were included in the Tigray region as part of the constitution adopted in 1995 under the TPLF-led Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. According to the Voice of America, the Amhara claims the land was taken from them when the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front took control of the national government. The involvement of other ethno-regional forces in the conflict might not only intensify the violence in the war against the Tigrayan forces, but spur other conflict as well. Vanda Felbar-Brown urges that after initial fighting TDF, many of the militias popping up around Ethiopia will turn against the capital as well as against one another in their conflict over resources and power distribution, even though some are likely to accommodate with TDF. Thank you so much for watching today's edition of editorials. My name is Sandra Asante. Do have a blessed afternoon.